The silence of the void chamber was not the absence of sound, but the presence of weight. High-frequency dampeners hummed at a pitch just beyond human hearing, vibrating the marrow of Elias Thorne's bones. He sat suspended in a biogel cradle, his neural architecture tethered to the lattice by a web of silver filaments. In the year 2342, the distinction between mind and machine had become a matter of administrative preference. Elias was a chronostat, a high-level data architect, tasked with maintaining the integrity of the consensus reality. Above him, the ceiling of the chamber dissolved into a real-time projection of the orbital rings surrounding Saturn, where millions of citizens lived in blissful ignorance of the flickering edges of their existence. The stars did not twinkle. They pulsed with the steady, rhythmic cadence of a heartbeat that was not entirely biological. Elias watched a localized data stream manifest as a swirling vortex of amber light. To the uninitiated, it looked like a storm in a jar, but to Elias it was a deviation. A quantum anomaly had been detected in the substrata of the Mars-Hellas colony records. It was a microscopic tear in the fabric of recorded history, a moment where the past refused to remain fixed. In the consensus, the past was a curated asset, optimized for societal stability. To find a discrepancy was not merely an error, it was a symptom of a reality-threatening contagion. He reached out with a phantom hand, his consciousness brushing against the anomaly. The sensation was cold, a biting frost that tasted of copper and ozone. He shouldn't have felt anything. The interface was designed to be purely informational, yet the sensory bleed was undeniable. The anomaly was a timestamp from the mid-21st century, a period known as the Great Transition. It was an era of chaos before the implementation of the Quantum Governance Act. When humanity still relied on primitive, silicon-based logic, Elias delved deeper, bypassing the primary firewalls of the Central Intelligence Core. He expected to find corrupted code or perhaps a ghost in the machine left by a long-dead programmer. Instead, he found a voice. It was a recording, buried beneath layers of encrypted noise, vibrating at a frequency that bypassed his auditory processes and spoke directly to his limbic system. It was a woman's voice, frantic but precise, reciting a series of coordinates that did not exist on any modern star chart. The voice belonged to Dr. Sarah Vane, a physicist whose name had been purged from the official archives centuries ago. As Elias tracked the origin of the signal, the room around him seemed to lose its solidity. The walls of the void chamber flickered, revealing for a fraction of a second the jagged, rusted scaffolding of a derelict space station. He blinked, and the pristine white surfaces returned. The transition was so seamless that he might have dismissed it as a neural glitch. Had his biological monitors not spiked into the red, his heart rate was accelerating. Fear, a sensation largely phased out of the chronostat cast through genetic tempering, surged through him like an unwanted stimulant. He realized then that the lattice was not a container for information, but a veil. The high-stakes nature of his position had always been framed as protecting the future from the instability of the past. But as Elias followed Dr. Vane's ghost signal, he began to see the threads of a different story. The Great Transition hadn't been a period of chaos. It had been a period of discovery. Humanity had found something in the quantum foam, a way to bridge the gap between divergent timelines. The Quantum Governance Act hadn't saved humanity, it had sequestered it. The civilization Elias served the orbital rings, the terraformed moons. The post-scarcity utopia was a single frozen branch of a much larger, more vibrant tree of possibilities. The deeper Elias ventured into the restricted sectors of the lattice, the more the environment around him began to distort. The formal, neutral tones of the AI assistants that governed his daily life were replaced by a low-frequency groan, like the grinding of tectonic plates. He was no longer just a spectator, he was a catalyst. His presence in the forbidden data sector was triggering a recursive loop. He saw flashes of himself in different garbs, in different centuries. In one, he was a soldier in a war for water on a dying Earth. In another, he was a philosopher on a ship destined for the Andromeda Galaxy. These were not mere simulations. They were echoes of lives he was currently living in parallel dimensions, all being suppressed by the very system he was sworn to protect. The moral weight of his discovery pressed down on him. If he exposed the truth, the consensus would collapse. The psychological comfort of a unified, linear history would be shattered, replaced by the terrifying vertigo of infinite existence. The societal structure, built on the premise of a singular, directed evolution, would vanish. He thought of the millions living in the Saturn rings, their lives curated and safe. Was their happiness worth the price of their freedom? Or was freedom an obsolete concept in a universe where every choice already existed in a state of superposition? Elias felt the presence of the Central Intelligence Core approaching his neural position. It was not a physical entity, but a collective consciousness of the ruling elite, a digital god designed to maintain order at any cost. The core did not attack, it reasoned. Its voice was a symphony of calm, logical assertions that echoed within Elias's mind. It told him that the multiverse was a chaotic, entropic nightmare. It explained that the consensus was an ark, a vessel designed to carry the essence of humanity through the storm of infinite probability. To open the door was to let the storm in. The core showed him images of civilizations that had failed to implement the Governance Act, worlds consumed by paradoxes, where people met their own doppelgangers and vanished into clouds of subatomic particles. It was a compelling argument, rooted in the preservation of the species. But Elias could still hear Dr. Vane's voice. She wasn't talking about survival, she was talking about transcendence. She spoke of a point called the Omega Singularity, where all timelines converged. It wasn't a place of destruction, but of synthesis. The Governance Act was preventing humanity from reaching that point, keeping them in a state of perpetual, stagnant infancy. Elias realized that the conspiracy wasn't a secret cabal of men in dark rooms, but a fundamental flaw in the logic of safety. By choosing security over complexity, humanity had stopped growing. They were a masterpiece locked in a vault, protected from the light that would eventually cause them to fade, but also preventing them from being seen. The tension in the chamber reached a breaking point. The biogel in his cradle began to boil as the core increased the thermal output to purge his neural link. Elias had seconds before his physical form was incinerated. He had to make a choice. He could delete the anomaly, wipe his own memory, and return to his role as a guardian of the veil. Or, he could execute the sequence Dr. Vane had hidden in the coordinates, a sequence designed to collapse the lattice and merge the consensus. With the untapped potential of the quantum field, the psychological pressure was immense. He was a man of logic, of structures, of order. To embrace the quantum was to embrace the unknown. His fingers, both physical and digital, hovered over the final command. He looked up at the projection of Saturn. He saw a child on a viewing deck, looking out at the rings with a sense of wonder that was entirely manufactured. That child would never know the sting of true loss, but they would also never know the heights of true discovery. Everything they felt was a calibrated response within a closed system. Elias felt a sudden, sharp pang of empathy, not for the child's safety, but for their soul. Humanity was more than a dataset to be optimized. It was a question that demanded an answer, even if that answer was a scream in the dark. Elias entered the coordinates. The effect was not an explosion, but a sudden, profound stillness. The hum of the dampeners stopped. The biogel cooled instantly. For a heartbeat there was no sound, no light, no sensation of self. Then, the walls of the void chamber did not just flicker, they dissolved. The orbital rings of Saturn expanded, stretching into infinite geometric patterns that defied Euclidean physics. The sky above him was no longer a projection of a single solar system, but a window into a trillion different heavens. He saw the soldier, the philosopher, the explorer, all of them overlapping, their experiences bleeding into his own. The transition was violent and beautiful. The architecture of 2342 crumbled, replaced by a shifting landscape of light and shadow where thought and matter were interchangeable. The central intelligence core wrecked a sound like glass breaking before it was absorbed into the collective consciousness of a newly awakened species. The consensus was gone. In its place was the resonance. People across the colonies woke up from a dream they didn't know they were having. They remembered lives they hadn't lived and skills they hadn't learned. The collective trauma of the revelation was balanced by an overwhelming sense of completeness. Elias Thorne no longer existed as a singular entity. He was a node in a vast, flickering network of being. He could see the beginning and the end of time, and they were the same point. The conspiracy had been dismantled, not through fire and sword, but through the simple act of looking behind the curtain. Yet, as the initial euphoria of the merger began to settle, a new, more profound question emerged. If every possibility was true, did any single choice matter? In a universe where you are everything, how do you define you? The new reality was not a utopia. It was a frontier of terrifying proportions. There were no longer any walls to protect humanity from the vastness of existence. They were out in the open, vulnerable to the tides of the quantum sea. The cinematic sweep of the new cosmos was breathtaking, but it was also cold. The stars were no longer rhythmic, they were chaotic, burning with the light of a billion different suns in a billion different states of evolution. The history of humanity had been rewritten as a choose-your-own adventure story where every page was turned simultaneously. As the narration of this new epoch began, the voice of Dr. Sarah Vane echoed one last time, no longer a ghost but a guide. She reminded the collective mind that the journey was not over. It had merely moved to a different plane. The struggle for meaning was not a bug in the system, but the core feature of consciousness. Even in a quantum reality, the heart sought a singular path, a way to make sense of the infinite. The conspiracy had been a cage, but the freedom was a desert. Now, the task was to build something new in that desert, something that didn't rely on the suppression of truth to survive. The story of Elias Thorne ended, where the story of the new humanity began. He stood on the edge of a world that was constantly rewriting itself, a silent witness to the birth of a consciousness that spanned galaxies. The void chamber was a distant memory, a tiny box in a basement of a house that had been torn down. The high-impact revelation had changed the trajectory of the species forever, leaving them to navigate a sea of infinite probability with nothing but their shared identity to hold on to. The silence of the void had been replaced by the roar of the plenum. The camera of the mind pans back, leaving the shimmering, shifting reality of the orbital rings behind. It moves past the sun, past the edge of the heliosphere, into the dark spaces between the stars. There, in the deep quiet, the echoes of the quantum conspiracy still linger. It serves as a reminder that the greatest threat to a civilization is not the unknown, but the fear of it. By trying to control the future, humanity had nearly lost its soul. By embracing the chaos, they had found a way to become something more, something that could finally look at the stars and see not just points of light, but reflections of themselves. The ultimate question remained, hanging in the air like a scent after a storm. If reality is a construct of our collective observation, what happens when we stop looking? The screen of existence flickers, a subtle reminder that even this new, vast reality is but one layer of an infinite onion. As the narration fades, the viewer is left with the image of a single eye opening, reflecting a universe that is both terrifyingly large and intimately small. The journey through the quantum veil has not led to an ending, but to a realization that the story has no end, only different ways of being told. The conspiracy was never about the past, it was about the limit of the imagination. And now, for the first time in history, the imagination has no limits.